The morning on HFY was peaceful, just like any other. The small colony, nestled on the edge of a dense, green forest, was home to a few hundred humans who had settled there to start a new life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting its warm glow over the land. Life was simple here, mostly farmers, mechanics, and a few soldiers who were stationed to protect the colony. Among the soldiers was Captain Elias Ford, a man who had seen the worst of battle but had grown tired of fighting. He and his small squad had been stationed here to keep an eye on the growing tensions between human colonies and the alien races that roamed the galaxy. But for now, the day was quiet. Elias sat on a low, rusted crate, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. His dark eyes, still sharp despite the years of war, looked out at the vast stretch of land before him. The colony was nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering mountains and thick forests. He could hear the faint hum of machinery from the nearby farms, a sound he had grown used to. The planet, despite its beauty, felt like a prison at times, isolated from the rest of the universe. "Captain Ford," a voice called from behind him. It was Sergeant Bonner, his right-hand man. Bonner was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a quiet demeanor, the kind of guy who preferred action over words. "Scanners just picked up something strange in the sky. Could be just space debris, but we should check it out." Elias gave a half-smile and stood up. "All right, let's have a look." The two of them walked toward the control center, a small building on the outskirts of the colony. Inside, the tech officers were already working frantically, their screens flickering with data. "We're seeing a cloaked ship entering the atmosphere," the lead officer, Lieutenant Harris, said, his voice tense. "It's big, and it's coming in fast." Elias frowned. A cloaked ship wasn't something you saw every day on HFY. "Vraxians," he muttered under his breath. The Vraxian Empire was one of the most advanced alien factions in the galaxy. They were known for their superior technology, AI-driven weapons, energy shields, and cloaking devices that made them nearly untouchable. If they were here, it meant trouble. Big trouble. Bonner turned to Elias. "What do we do, Captain?" "We wait," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "No need to jump to conclusions. It could be just a patrol or a reconnaissance mission." But deep down, Elias wasn't so sure. He had seen this before. The sudden arrival of alien ships, the mocking arrogance of their commanders. The Vraxians often sent ships like this to show their superiority over human colonies. It was their way of reminding everyone just how outmatched they were. Hours passed in uneasy silence. The Vraxian ship, still cloaked, hovered silently above the colony. The humans below were unaware of the danger, going about their daily routines as if nothing was wrong. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He could sense it in the air. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence was shattered. A deep, booming voice echoed across the colony, coming from the alien ship above. It was in a language the humans didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, condescending, mocking, and full of menace. The voice switched to Galactic Standard, the universal language of the galaxy. "We are the Vraxians. Your weapons are toys, and your defenses are nothing more than a joke. Prepare yourselves for annihilation." The word sent a chill down Elias's spine. The Vraxians weren't here for a simple mission. They were here to crush the humans. The mocking tone of the voice made it clear that the aliens had no respect for humanity. They thought the humans were weak, insignificant, and no match for their advanced technology. Elias's hand instinctively went to his sidearm. His mind raced. What were their options? They didn't have the advanced weaponry the Vraxians had. No cloaking devices, no energy shields. They had old guns, grenades, and a few homemade explosives. That was it. The humans had never stood a chance against the Vraxians' high-tech arsenal. But there was one thing the Vraxians didn't understand: the spirit of humanity. The Vraxians could have all the advanced technology in the galaxy, But they didn't have the one thing that had allowed humans to survive for centuries: their will to fight. Elias turned to Bonner. "Get the men ready," he ordered. "We're going to show them just how dangerous our toys can be." As Bonner ran off to gather the soldiers, Elias's thoughts turned to the other humans in the colony. The farmers, the engineers, the children. What would happen to them if the Vraxians attacked? They were no soldiers, just civilians trying to make a life for themselves. He couldn't let them fall victim to these aliens. "We've faced worse odds before," Elias muttered to himself. "And we've always come out on top." He wasn't going to let these aliens, these bullies, destroy everything he had worked so hard to protect. The Vraxians might have had the upper hand, but Elias was about to remind them of something they had clearly forgotten. Sometimes it wasn't the weapons that made the difference. It was the heart of the fighter. And humans had plenty of heart. The battle for HFY was about to begin, and Elias was ready to show the Vraxians just what their toys could do. The first shot was deafening. It echoed through the still night air of HFY, shattering the fragile calm that had lasted for so long. The soldiers, all standing by and waiting for a sign to act, flinched at the sound. Elias had told them to hold their fire, but as soon as the voice from the Vraxian ship had boomed its arrogant threat, something inside him snapped. Without waiting for further orders, he had pulled the trigger on his rifle, a signal to his men that the time for waiting had passed. Bonner, who had been watching from a distance, caught the motion and followed Elias's lead. One shot turned into 5, then 10, as the soldiers who had gathered outside the base opened fire on the Vraxian ship, which hovered just above the trees. The lasers from their old, battered guns cut through the night, but it was no use. The beams barely made a dent in the alien vessel's force field. The Vraxians, with their cloaking technology, seemed untouchable. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the voice from the ship rang out again, this time even colder. "You think your toys can harm us?" it mocked. "Your primitive weapons are nothing." Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the Vraxians, their ship still cloaked, hovering above them. His rifle felt like a toy in his hands now, just like the Vraxians had said. But it wasn't the weapon that made the difference. It was the will behind it. Even with the odds stacked against them, Elias refused to back down. "Keep firing," he shouted, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let them think they can just walk all over us." The soldiers, though shaken, rallied behind their captain. They fired again and again, hoping to make a dent in the enemy's defenses, but it was clear that they were outmatched. Their weapons were nothing compared to the alien technology they faced. Then, as if mocking their efforts, the Vraxians made their move. The cloaked ship slowly decloaked, revealing its full size. It was far larger than any ship the humans had seen before, its sleek black hull glimmering in the dim light. The ship's weapons were massive, and before Elias could even react, a blast of energy erupted from the ship's underside, hitting the ground with an explosive force. The blast sent a shockwave through the air, knocking the humans off their feet and sending several soldiers flying backward. Elias felt his body slam into the dirt, the air knocked out of his lungs. When he opened his eyes, the world around him was spinning. He saw Bonner, struggling to stand, his arm bleeding from a gash caused by the blast. "Fall back," Elias shouted, his voice hoarse. "Fall back to the base. Get to cover." The soldiers scrambled to retreat, but not all of them made it. One by one, the Vraxian ship's weapons fired, each blast knocking down trees, tearing through the ground, and sending debris flying in every direction. Elias's eyes scanned the battlefield, but there was little he could do now. The Vraxians had proven their power in a matter of seconds. Despite their primitive weapons, the humans had managed to land a few hits on the ship's force field, but it was clear they were outgunned. It wasn't supposed to go down like this. In the chaos, Elias saw a figure lying motionless on the ground. It was Private Jensen, one of the newest recruits. He was young, barely out of his teens, and full of hope when he joined the military. Elias's heart sank as he recognized the bloodied figure of the soldier who had always been so eager to prove himself. "No!" Elias shouted, pushing through the wreckage to reach Jensen's side. But as he knelt beside the young man, it was clear that it was too late. Jensen's chest was still, his eyes wide open in shock. "We couldn't protect them," Bonner muttered as he stumbled over to Elias, holding his bleeding arm. "We're just too weak. We're out of our league here." Elias's eyes narrowed as he looked at the Vraxian ship above them. There was a deep anger rising inside him. They had underestimated humanity. They had mocked their weapons, laughed at their strength, and now they had taken lives. But Elias wasn't going to let this be the end. Not for Jensen. Not for anyone. "Don't say that, Bonner," Elias growled, his voice full of fire. "We're not done yet. This fight isn't over. We're going to make them regret ever underestimating us." Bonner, though injured, managed a weak smile. "You're right, Captain. We don't give up. Not ever." Elias looked around, surveying the wreckage and the fallen soldiers. The Vraxians had made a deadly mistake. They thought their technology made them invincible, that they could squash humanity with a single blow. But they had no idea what humans were capable of when they had nothing left to lose. "We fight with what we have," Elias said, gritting his teeth. "We may not have their advanced weapons, but we have something they'll never understand. We fight for each other. We fight for our homes, our families, and everything we've built. They've made a deadly mistake, and we're going to make them pay for it." The soldiers, though battered and bruised, nodded. Their determination was like a fire, slowly building again, fueled by the pain and loss they had already suffered. They were far from being done. The fight was just beginning. The Vraxians had made a deadly mistake, and Elias Ford was going to make sure they regretted underestimating humanity. The first clash had been devastating, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The Vraxians had made a deadly mistake. Their ship hovered above the battlefield, mocking humanity's feeble attempts to fight back. The blasts from their weapons had left the soldiers reeling, many injured, some dead. Elias stood among the wreckage, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to turn the tide. The situation seemed hopeless. Their guns were useless against the Vraxian technology. The soldiers were battered and bruised, and the enemy was stronger, more advanced. But Elias had something that the Vraxians didn't understand. Humanity had something they could never take away: ingenuity. He looked around, his eyes scanning the wreckage of their makeshift camp. The Vraxian weapons had left deep craters in the earth. Trees were reduced to splinters, and the sound of the battle still echoed in his ears. But amidst the destruction, there was something else. There was always something, a glimmer of hope, a flicker of an idea that could change everything. "Bonner," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with determination, "I need you to gather the others. We're not giving up." Bonner, still holding his wounded arm, nodded and limped away to rally the rest of the soldiers. Elias turned to the wreckage, his mind working faster than his body could follow. He could hear the hum of the Vraxian ship above them, the subtle noise of their cloaking system hiding them from sight. But Elias wasn't focused on that right now. He was focused on the earth beneath him. He crouched down, inspecting the craters left by the Vraxian blasts. The soil was still warm, a sign of how recently the weapons had fired. The soil and rock had been blasted apart, but there was something else, something strange. The debris had shifted in a way that reminded him of a structure. An idea began to form in his mind. "Ingenuity," he muttered under his breath. "We can't beat them with their technology. But maybe we don't need to. Maybe we can use the earth itself." Elias stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to act fast. He didn't know how much time they had before the Vraxians launched another devastating strike. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure the others were following his lead. "All right," Elias said, his voice carrying through the chaos. "We're going to make something they won't expect. Gather all the scrap you can find. Weapons, armor, anything you can carry. We're going to use what we have." The soldiers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, scavenging whatever was left of their equipment and using it to their advantage. Elias worked alongside them, pulling pieces of scrap metal from the wreckage, tearing apart old equipment, and fitting them together in ways he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't much, but it didn't have to be. They didn't need fancy tech to beat the Vraxians. They just needed to outsmart them. As the soldiers worked, Elias's mind raced. The Vraxians had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to innovate. They had expected them to be easy prey, to collapse in fear after the first devastating strike. But humans weren't like that. When pushed to the brink, they fought harder, they fought smarter. Elias wasn't about to let them down now. "Bonner, get the plasma grenades," Elias shouted. "We'll need those to create a distraction. The Vraxians won't know what hit them." Bonner nodded, his face grim but determined. He ran off to gather the grenades, leaving Elias to finish the plan. The soldiers worked in unison, piecing together their improvised weapon as quickly as possible. The Vraxians were still above them, cloaked and silent, but Elias could sense that they were getting ready for another attack. He couldn't wait any longer. "All right," Elias said, standing up and surveying the makeshift weapon they had created. "This is it. We got one shot at this. Make it count." The weapon they had put together was crude, but effective. It wasn't a laser gun or plasma rifle, but it didn't need to be. They had taken the scraps from their broken equipment, old engines, bits of scrap metal, and energy cells, and fused them into a makeshift EMP device. It wouldn't take down the Vraxian ship completely, but it would disrupt its cloaking system long enough to give them a fighting chance. Elias glanced at Bonner, who was ready with the plasma grenades. "We fire the EMP first. Once it hits, Bonner, you throw the grenades. We'll hit them hard while they're still stunned." The soldiers took their positions, their eyes locked on the cloaked ship above them. The tension was unbearable. The EMP device hummed in Elias's hands, the energy it contained ready to be unleashed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he didn't hesitate. This was their only chance. He pressed the button. The EMP shot out in a burst of blue energy, streaking toward the Vraxian ship. There was a moment of complete silence, and then nothing. The cloaked ship flickered for a brief moment, its invisible hull momentarily becoming visible. The EMP had hit. Before the Vraxians could react, Bonner threw the grenades. The explosion was deafening, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. The Vraxian ship was rocked by the blast, their cloaking system failing completely. For the first time since the battle began, the Vraxian ship was vulnerable. Elias's heart raced as he watched the ship begin to shake, its systems failing in the wake of the attack. The soldiers didn't wait. They fired their guns with everything they had, aiming for the exposed weak points in the ship's hull. It wasn't enough to bring the ship down, but it was enough to make the Vraxians pause. They had underestimated humanity's resourcefulness, and now they were paying the price. Elias's eyes burned with determination as he watched the battle unfold. The Vraxians had thought their advanced technology would make them unbeatable. They had thought the humans were nothing more than primitive toys. But now, they were facing something they could never have predicted: human ingenuity. "We're not done yet," Elias said, his voice steady with resolve. "This fight is far from over." The smoke from the explosion still lingered in the air, thick and acrid, clinging to the charred remains of the battlefield. The Vraxian ship, once cloaked in near invisibility, now hovered above them, damaged but still very much a threat. The EMP had shaken them, but it hadn't brought them down. The Vraxians were regrouping, their shields flickering back to life, readying themselves for retaliation. Elias knew that time was running out. They couldn't afford to wait. The human soldiers had made their stand, but they were outnumbered, and their weapons were no match for the alien technology. But Elias wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He stared at the wreckage around him. the remains of fallen comrades, the makeshift weapons they had created from scraps. It was all they had left. No more high-tech gear. No more tricks up their sleeves. They were down to the basics: survival and the will to fight. "Bonner," Elias called out, his voice steady but tense. "We need to go for the heart of their ship. If we can breach their main core, we can shut them down. We'll end this fight here and now." Bonner, still limping from his earlier injury, nodded without hesitation. His face was grim, but there was no fear in his eyes. "Lead the way, Elias," he said. "We're with you." Elias looked around at the rest of the soldiers. They were battered, tired, and most were nursing injuries, but the resolve in their eyes matched his own. They had fought this hard, this long. They weren't about to back down now. "All right," Elias said, taking a deep breath. "We have one shot at this. We make it count, or we don't make it at all." The Vraxian ship was hovering just above them, its cloaking system reactivated, though not fully restored. The damage they had caused had disrupted its defenses, but it wasn't enough. It was still far too powerful. The soldiers had no choice but to take the fight to them, to go directly into the heart of their enemy's ship. The only problem was that doing so would be dangerous, more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. The plan was simple, but it carried huge risks. They would have to get close enough to board the Vraxian ship, using whatever they could to shield themselves from the enemy's fire. Once they were inside, they would make their way to the core, plant a series of explosives, and trigger them remotely. It was a high-stakes gamble, and if they failed, there would be no second chance. But Elias wasn't the type to give up. He had seen too much destruction, too much loss, to stop now. As the team moved out, Elias's mind raced through the possibilities. The Vraxians were powerful, but they had a weakness, one they hadn't anticipated: the human resolve. Humanity had proven time and time again that they were capable of the unimaginable when backed into a corner. And that's exactly what they were now, cornered. The first step of the plan was getting to the Vraxian ship without being detected. They would have to use the debris and wreckage as cover, moving quietly, staying out of sight. The soldiers split into small teams, each one assigned a specific task. Elias led the charge, using his sharp instincts to guide them through the wreckage. The Vraxians were still disoriented, their systems not fully recovered from the EMP, but they wouldn't be for long. "We need to move fast," Elias muttered to Bonner, who was beside him. "The longer we wait, the stronger they get. We don't have much time." Bonner nodded in agreement. He had seen the same thing Elias had. The Vraxians were regaining their composure, and if they didn't act soon, it would be too late. The team pressed on, inching closer to the Vraxian ship. Elias's heart raced in his chest as he thought about the dangers ahead. They were about to board a ship that was far superior in technology, with weapons that could obliterate them in an instant. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far to fail. The Vraxian ship loomed larger as they got closer. It was a massive, sleek vessel, its dark, metallic surface glinting in the dim light. It hovered silently, its advanced cloaking system barely visible. Elias knew that once they got too close, the Vraxians would detect them. But they couldn't wait any longer. "Now," Elias whispered. The team burst into action, sprinting toward the ship. The Vraxian sentries, still recovering from the earlier explosion, were caught off guard. The humans managed to breach the perimeter of the ship, their movements quick and coordinated. The Vraxians fired back, but the human soldiers were ready. They had expected this. They had prepared for it. Elias, leading the charge, dove behind a large piece of debris to avoid the incoming fire. His pulse was pounding in his ears, his body moving on pure adrenaline. The soldiers around him did the same, using the wreckage to shield themselves as they closed the distance between themselves and the enemy ship. "Keep moving," Elias shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. "We can't let them regroup." The soldiers pressed forward, moving in a blur of motion. The Vraxian weapons were powerful, but the humans were faster, more agile. They reached the ship's hull in record time, climbing up the side and finding a weak point to break through. "We're in," Bonner said, his voice tense with excitement. "Let's go." Elias nodded. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. They had to reach the core and plant the explosives before the Vraxians could recover. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to waste a second. The human soldiers moved swiftly through the ship's corridors, using their knowledge of Vraxian technology to bypass security systems. It wasn't easy, and they had to be careful not to trigger alarms. The Vraxians were fierce, but the humans had something they didn't: the element of surprise. "Almost there," Elias said, his eyes scanning the dimly lit passageway ahead. "Stay sharp." Bonner, who had been covering him, nodded and moved to the console, setting the final charge that would trigger the explosion. The Vraxians were closing in fast, and the room was getting smaller by the second. The countdown had begun, and they had no time to waste. "Everyone, get out," Bonner yelled to the rest of the team. "Now." The soldiers scrambled, retreating toward the exit as the core began to glow brighter, pulsing with energy. Elias and Bonner were the last to leave, the last to ensure that the final charge was set. The ground beneath them rumbled as the explosion grew closer. They had done it. They had destroyed the core, and with it, the Vraxian ship. The moment of truth had arrived. The Vraxians, so sure of their victory, were now realizing the full extent of their mistake. Their technology had been their downfall. And now, humanity's triumph was inevitable. As Elias and Bonner sprinted toward the exit, the ship began to tremble, the core destabilizing. The explosion was imminent. With a final, resounding explosion, the Vraxian ship was torn apart. The shockwave hit them hard, throwing them off their feet. The ground shook violently as debris flew through the air. But Elias and Bonner didn't stop. They kept running, pushing through the chaos, the fire, and the destruction. They had won. Humanity had triumphed over the Vraxians. As they reached the escape pod, Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe. The fight had been hard, but they had made it. The Vraxians, who had once mocked humanity's weapons, were now defeated. The human soldiers had proven their strength, their resourcefulness, and their ability to fight back against overwhelming odds. As the escape pod shot away from the wreckage of the Vraxian ship, Elias looked out into the vast expanse of space. The stars were silent, watching over them. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Humanity had won, and the universe would never underestimate them again. The aftermath of the battle left the stars eerily quiet. The once formidable Vraxian ship had been reduced to nothing more than smoldering debris drifting in the cold emptiness of space. Elias and his team sat in the cramped escape pod, the harsh reality of their victory settling in. The fire of the battle had been replaced by an eerie silence, the kind that followed after the storm had passed. The faces of his comrades were a mix of relief and exhaustion. The fight had been brutal, and many good men and women had given their lives, but it had not been in vain. Humanity had won. The pod's interior hummed softly, the only sound now the steady pulse of the engines. Elias glanced around at his team, his fellow soldiers, their faces worn and battle-hardened. They had gone through hell together, and they had come out victorious. But Elias knew that the victory came with a price. Bonner, who sat across from him, gave a tired smile, the kind that only comes after surviving something unimaginable. "We did it, Elias. We actually did it." Elias nodded, his eyes distant. He was still processing everything. The Vraxians had underestimated them, thought they were just primitive creatures with little chance against their advanced technology. But the humans had something the Vraxians couldn't comprehend: the will to fight, the ingenuity to adapt, and the heart to survive. But the loss weighed heavily on Elias. They had lost too many good soldiers. Bonner's squad had taken the brunt of the Vraxian assault, and their sacrifices were not lost on him. Elias couldn't shake the images of his fallen comrades. Their faces, their voices, their laughs, all gone. He closed his eyes, pushing the grief away for now. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not yet. As the escape pod sped away from the wreckage, the communication systems finally flickered to life. The familiar voice of General Hawk crackled through the speaker. "Elias, Bonner, this is Hawk. Do you copy?" Elias took a deep breath and pressed the comms button. "We copy, General. The mission was a success. The Vraxian ship is down." There was a brief pause before Hawk's voice returned, tinged with relief. "Good work, soldier. You've made history today. I'll be sending a recovery team to pick you up. Prepare to return home." The words hit Elias like a wave. Return home. It seemed surreal, almost impossible. After everything they had been through, the idea of home seemed like something distant, something that belonged to a life they had left behind. But now, it was within reach. They had fought for it. They had earned it. Bonner looked over at Elias. "Home. Can you believe it? We're actually going back." The tension in the air was thick, each soldier aware of the danger surrounding them. But they pushed forward, their resolve hardening with every step. The final push was upon them, and they had no choice but to give everything they had. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. If they failed now, all would be lost. Elias glanced at his team, their faces grim but determined. They were in this together, and together, they would finish the fight. There was no turning back. This was it. The air inside the Vraxian ship was thick with tension. Every footstep, every breath felt like it could be the last. Elias and his team moved silently through the dimly lit halls, their weapons drawn and ready. The countdown to their victory, or defeat, was ticking away with each passing second. The Vraxians, though technologically superior, had underestimated humanity's determination. They thought of their weapons as toys, dismissing the human soldiers as insignificant. But the tables had turned, and the soldiers had shown them just how deadly those toys could be. The core of the ship was just ahead, and Elias could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. They had made it this far, past the Vraxian defenses, past their heavy artillery. But now, in the heart of the ship, the real test was about to begin. The core was heavily guarded, and Elias knew that one wrong move would trigger an alarm, sending the whole ship into a defensive frenzy. But failure wasn't an option. Not after everything they had fought for. Bonner, who had been by his side through this entire ordeal, looked at him and nodded. They didn't need words. They both understood the gravity of the situation. Their comrades, those who were still alive, were counting on them. They had come this far together, and they weren't going to fail now. "On three," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet, tense atmosphere. 1, 2, 3. With a swift, synchronized movement, they burst into the room that housed the Vraxian core. The room was large, filled with glowing alien machinery and pulsating lights. The hum of the ship's energy was deafening, and the core itself was a massive glowing orb suspended in midair by advanced Vraxian technology. This was the heart of the ship, the source of its power. If they could destroy it, they could bring down the entire vessel. But there was no time to waste. The Vraxians had been expecting them. A group of heavily armored soldiers appeared, their weapons raised, aiming directly at Elias and his team. The air crackled with the threat of incoming fire. Elias's mind raced, calculating their odds, trying to find a way out of this. But then he remembered the one thing that had brought them this far: their resourcefulness, their ability to adapt, and their sheer will to survive. "Move," Elias yelled, ducking behind a large console for cover. Gunfire erupted around them, the sound of energy blasts filling the air. The Vraxian soldiers were relentless, their weapons tearing through the air with deadly precision. Elias and Bonner returned fire, their human-made weapons now proving their worth as they cut through the Vraxian armor. Elias's heart raced in his chest as he fired. He could hear the screams of his comrades over the comms, the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing through the corridors. They were making their stand, holding their ground. But Elias knew they needed more than just firepower to win this. They needed a plan, and fast. "Bonner," Elias shouted, pulling out a small device from his pack. "Cover me. I'm going to disable their security systems. If I can hack into their core, we can trigger the explosion." Bonner nodded, already knowing what to do. "You got it. Just be quick." With a quick glance, Elias sprinted toward the center of the room, dodging fire as he went. The Vraxians were relentless, but he had no choice. This was it. He reached the console at the heart of the room, where the core was located. His hands moved swiftly, typing commands into the alien interface, his mind focused on the task ahead. The security systems were complex, but not impossible to crack. The Vraxians had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated human ingenuity. Elias could feel the sweat on his brow as he typed faster. The Vraxians were closing in, their energy blasts getting closer with each passing second. But Elias refused to be distracted. He couldn't afford to fail now. His hands flew across the console, bypassing the security protocols, hacking into the Vraxian network. He had done this before, in training, but now it was real. Now it was life or death. The seconds felt like hours as he worked. And then, with a sudden, satisfying beep, the console blinked green. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I've got it," he shouted. "Now, we need to move." Elias managed a small smile. "Feels unreal, doesn't it?" The pod continued its journey through space, the stars stretching out before them. But in Elias's mind, the vastness of the universe seemed smaller now. Humanity had proven it could stand up to the odds, to the alien forces that thought they were invincible. But that victory, as sweet as it was, came with a heavy price. They had stopped the Vraxian threat, but there were always more enemies lurking in the dark corners of space. The battle was won, but the war, that was far from over. As the pod neared the recovery ship, Elias looked out into the endless void of space. The stars had always been a symbol of wonder to him, a reminder of the vast unknown. But now, they seemed different. They felt like a challenge, an invitation to reach further, to explore what lay beyond. Humanity had taken its first step into the cosmos, and now nothing seemed impossible. The recovery ship, a massive vessel designed for deep space missions, loomed ahead, its sleek, metallic hull glinting in the light of distant stars. It was a reminder of what they had fought for, a future among the stars, a place where humanity could grow and thrive. As the escape pod docked with the recovery ship, the door hissed open, revealing a group of soldiers and engineers waiting to greet them. They were met with applause, a small but heartfelt gesture of appreciation for their sacrifice. Elias stepped out first, his boots hitting the metal floor of the ship. Bonner followed, and the rest of the team filed out behind them. "Welcome home," one of the engineers said with a nod. But Elias didn't feel at home just yet, not with the faces of the fallen still fresh in his mind. The ship's interior was a blur of activity as the recovery team went to work, securing the pod and assisting the soldiers. Elias was led to a debriefing room, where General Hawk was waiting for him. The man stood tall, his uniform pristine despite the chaos of the battle. "You've made us proud, Elias," Hawk said, his voice firm but full of respect. "What you and your team did today will be remembered for generations. You've secured humanity's future." Elias nodded, but the weight of his thoughts still lingered. "We lost a lot of good people out there, sir." Hawk's face softened. "I know, but they didn't die in vain. They died to protect all of us, and we will honor them by ensuring their sacrifices were not for nothing." Elias met the general's gaze. It wasn't easy to accept the cost of their victory, but he knew that it was the price of war. The universe wasn't kind, and the Vraxians had learned it the hard way. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with, and they had proven that even against the most advanced technology, the human spirit could not be broken. As the ship sped toward Earth, Elias allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle was over, but the journey had only just begun. There would be more challenges ahead, more enemies to face, and more sacrifices to make. But humanity was no longer the underdog. They had found their place among the stars, and nothing would stop them now. With the stars stretching endlessly before them, Elias smiled. The universe had just learned a very important lesson. Never underestimate humanity.